Hello, maybe. Hello. Responsible media. Hi. Nice to see you all. No judgment for those people leaving. It's a very busy, very popular festival. I'm here to talk about responsible media, and I always think it's important to talk about kind of almost the two sides of my life, two-part sides of my personality. So sometimes I talk about what I've done in my career, Mondelez, Diageo, some of them are here, GSK. These days I work for Beam Suntory. So if you haven't heard of us, we're kind of the fusion of American bourbon, Jim Beam, Maker's Mark, owned nowadays by the Suntory whiskey. If you've seen Lost in Translation, or if you are a fan of good whiskey, you probably know Suntory. And if you've still no idea who we are, we're Lucozade and Ribena in the UK, so you might have heard of them. And that is kind of who I do in my day job. I've joined this business, Beam Suntory. We're an interesting business. We are a global premium spirits company. But if we're honest, we're not that global, and we're not always that premium. So we're on a journey to improve both of those things. And actually, we've really been like a sales force and product-driven business for the over hundreds of years that many of our brands have existed. And we're really stepping up to say, if we want to build fantastic brands, if we want to build global icons, if we want everyone in the world to know what Maker's Mark is when you see it on the back shelf of a bar, we have to really tell that story. And that's why I've been building a new global media and marketing function at the heart of that business. But there is another half to me. I'm a gay man. I got married at the end of last year. I volunteer at a thing called Advertising, if you don't know what that is, in what is going to be a real conscious advertising network hat trick. I'm also on one of the boards at Cannes. And if you're starting to get the sense that maybe you should be involved in the Conscious Advertising Network, that's probably a good outtake. I also sit on the WFA's Diversity and Media Board, and we'll come back to that in a bit. At some point, when I had a bit of gardening leave, I randomly wrote a book in which I interviewed 20 far more intelligent and experienced people than me on how we make our marketing more inclusive. So I bring all that together when I think about media, when I think about what good media is. And if you've been in the room for the last couple of panels, I think we've heard some really, really good points, especially from an environment perspective, for everything Dino was talking about in terms of AI, that when we think about media, we need to rethink what we say. We need to think beyond just, how cheap can we buy it? How many eyeballs can we get? And I think the big switch that I've seen in my mind and some other people's minds over the last few years is to really think about advertising as an investment in the media ecosystem of the future. So for sure, every dollar we spend in media it's an investment in our brands. It has to work for our brands. It has to help our brands grow. But it's also an investment in where those brands can appear in the coming years. It's an investment in whether quality news exists. And it's an investment in whether quality entertainment exists. You know, we heard some of the stats about made-for-advertising websites. Every dollar that you put into a made-for-advertising website doesn't do a great job for your brand. We can tell that through various different measures, and it definitely doesn't do a good job for society because it's money going to clickbait, it's money going to bad actors, it's money going to bad places. So when we start to think about, it's an unusual situation, building a global media team from scratch, we wanted to build that into it. And some, not necessarily all of the areas that we think about are, in the environmental sustainability. You've heard a bit about that this morning, hopefully, so I won't go into that in too much detail. Really social inclusion in an increasingly kind of toxic and alienated world. How do we actually make sure we are funding positive voices? Maybe all of us work for brands, for companies that ultimately want to have a more inclusive, want to have a more diverse world. And if we're not careful, our media can fund quite the opposite of that. Truth, governance, misinformation. We're about to go into a US election cycle, we're about to go into a UK election cycle. Neither of those are going to be fun, whatever side of the political spectrum you stand on. And it's our responsibility as advertisers to try and make sure we're not funding some of the worst stuff in that space. And often the most damaging, most made-up false political lies aren't actually politically motivated, it's advertising motivated. People create fake news. There was a great interview with a guy back in the day who created the Hillary Clinton runs a child ring from a pizza party story. It was, it's a ridiculous story. He created it because he got great clickbait and he made lots of money from advertisers. He actually voted Democrat. So we think about that, and in particular, we've been thinking a bit about social inclusion. I think increasingly this is something the industry talks about, but to begin with, when we started talking about DE&I, rightly, we've talked about the teams, the people we have alongside us, how we actually make our industry more inclusive. The all-in census, the WFA census shows us that we haven't made huge progress in that territory. I think increasingly as an industry, we think about the DE&I, what we put out in the world. What does our content look like? Who's in our ads? Does that represent the consumers we're talking to? But from a media perspective, it absolutely matters what media channels we're buying, where we're appearing, who's seeing our content. I know some of the brand advance team here at GSK, we used to do a big partnership with them, making sure that our content is really getting seen in front of some of those different consumers. And indeed, our US team does a whole load of that stuff. We did this great partnership with this black-owned organisation called One Digital with Maker's Mark, working with different influencers, different content. We did something specifically with the Latinx community, NGL Collective. Really great case studies, but actually they tend to get talked about as multicultural marketing. They tend to get talked about as like a specific thing that we will do to talk to those different communities, to represent those communities. I don't think it's fair to say to tick a box, but sometimes in some companies it can feel like that. And our challenge was, how do we really make sure that everything we're doing, in every campaign we're doing, we're thinking about inclusion, we're thinking about environment, we're thinking about all those pieces. So we've been working on a new media model, and because I'm a marketer at heart, trapped in a media function, I gave it an unnecessarily over-the-top name and branding and things, and we call it Liquid and Looped. And part of that is really about our fundamentals. How do we make sure that our media flows as well as our liquid flows, that it flows right down through the funnel, that it has the same quality as we'd expect from our liquid? Part of that is looped, which is really how do we build a new way of thinking about media. You know, we aren't a giant GSK, we're not as big as Diageo, we're a smaller company with a more premium audience. How do we use data, personalization, CRM even, to talk to some of those people? And so we have different things that my team cares about. You know, we have measurement, we have how we activate across the funnel, we have our perfect serve, which is really about how we show up in media. We have this sort of idea of a data cycle. How does every single thing we put out into the world bring us data back in? How do we think, again, about how we buy media? What's our way of working with our agencies? What do we do ourselves? How do we drive innovation within that? But across all of that, across everything we do, I've challenged my team, don't ever present me on any of those things without considering these two things. The boring one, which finance and procurement likes, which is, you know, how is this driving efficiency? How is it driving effectiveness? And the future-proof one, which is how does this lead to conscious media? And so when we're talking about measurement, and my team do a great presentation around effectiveness and what we're doing, what it is, I would challenge it, well, how are we also measuring our social footprint? How are we also measuring our eco footprint? How are we doing that in line with our business's goals? And the answer is it's not always easy. It's not always super, super easy in different markets, different countries, easy to track certain things. But we force ourselves to ask that. When we think about data, I think it's easier as marketers to get caught up in this loop of, well, I want more of my consumer data. I need more of my consumer data. But how do we do that ethically? How do we do that in a way that's fair and honest and rewarding, that actually builds a better future ecosystem? And because we are Japanese owned, we also like to throw in a Japanese word every now and then. And we talk about monozukuri, which is kind of the craft of making our liquids. We talk about quality in our business as quality. When I worked at Mondelez, the quality function in the business, the job was to make sure that every single Oreo in that business is made the same. It's the same good quality. In our business, the quality function is to make sure that every year we make something better than we made it the year before. That's why Suntory whiskey is the best in the world, thank you, according to some people. And so we think about the same in our media, not just how do we get to good media, not just how do we get to like viewability and attention and some nice tick boxing, but how do we really push that to the next level? And actually the thing I'm most keen to tell you, because fun as our stuff is, it's actually probably more relevant to what we can all do together. And it's a real challenge because there's no single company in the world, even if the other Jerry D'Angelo from Procter & Gamble stood here with his 8 billion or whatever they spend in media. No one company in the world can change this. So how do we build this ecosystem together? And actually the thing I'd like to talk to you for just a couple of minutes and land you with is a bit of work just launched by the WFA on their Global Media Charter. And also a bit of work that it really is, you know, everything's just flowing into itself. I think next on stage you've got Hannah and Isabel who've done some work with Diageo, and together we created this guide on D&I and some other people on the panel, not just those two. But together we created this guide on diversity and representation in media. So if you're thinking about how do you make your media more inclusive, it's a great guide. But actually this guide, the Global Media Charter, and you've probably no idea who the WFA Global Media Board is, you probably don't care, but honestly, they're really nice, really interesting people. And together we've come up with 5, had to count them there, 5 things that we think the industry really, really needs to think about and go into. And I'm not going to talk about it in any depth at all. because we haven't got time. But actually, after this, if you just do one thing, we'll do two things. Check out the Conscious Advertising Network and look up the WFA Global Media Charter. And honestly, I think it's a really good document that sets the direction for where we want to be in our industry. And there was a version of this document about 5 years ago when we first talked about viewability, brand safety, and bits like that led to GARM, that led to a lot of stuff. And so we're more or less at time, but just the things it talks about are completion, competition, and plurality. How do we make sure that everyone in our industry has a fair chance to compete for our money? How do we truly measure everything? How do we make everything accountable? There's a lot of work going on about cross-platform network, measuring responsibility in society, the piece that myself and Isabel chair, really think about what is the role of media in terms of building a future-proofed ecosystem. How do you just stop and think about every dollar you spend in media as an investment in that ecosystem you want in the future? Sustainability in the planet. How do we really, really think about our carbon footprint? And actually, really great panel on that earlier today, but also in our content, how do you make sure you're encouraging recycling in that? And people and partners, and this is a massive one, especially on a day like today when brands, agencies, media owners all stand together in a very crowded Madfest. How do we create the right balance in industry? How do we get the right people coming in industry? How do we deal with our talent crisis? How do we make sure we have the right people wanting to work in media? So check out the WFA's Media Chart. It's a great document, and we've used it as a bit of a North Star internally in our business as we reboot that. And there is a great book on inclusive marketing if you really want to get into the weeds of this that I can, only thoroughly recommend. But thank you very much. I'm not sure we have time for questions, but honestly, Isabel's on the next panel, so just ask her the tough questions, and we're laughing.
Jerry, thank you very much. The Monosecurity of presenters. Thank you very much.